What if Melisandre wasn't truly wrong about Stannis Baratheon just early? It's a question that cuts to the heart of George R.R. Martin's storytelling, where prophecy and fate twist like the roots of the ancient weirwoods. In the Flames, Melisandre saw a warrior, a king with a great destiny, the one who would lead the living against the coming darkness. She believed that man was Stannis, a figure as unbending as the iron-wrought halls of Dragonstone. But with Stannis dead in both the HBO series and seemingly cornered in the books, many assume Melisandre simply misread her visions. But what if there's more to it? What if Stannis' story isn't quite finished, and his death, like so much else in the fog of war, is not what it seems? To understand this, we must first appreciate what Stannis represents. He is a man defined by duty, honor, and an unwavering belief in justice, often to his own detriment. Unlike his charismatic brother, Robert, or the cunning Renly, Stannis is a cold, iron-willed leader, the embodiment of lawful determination. This aligns closely with the archetype of the sacrificed king or the bitter champion, a figure willing to pay any price to protect his realm, even if it means becoming the villain in his own story. Melisandre's mistake may not have been choosing the wrong king, but rather misunderstanding the shape his destiny would take. In her mind, the flames always spoke clearly, but like many prophecies, their truths are shrouded in layers of interpretation. Consider the Battle of Winterfell as it stands in A Dance with Dragons. Stannis, stranded in a frozen wasteland, is facing the might of House Bolton and the bitter northern snows. Yet, Stannis the survivor has already outmaneuvered Ramsay's forces in the woods, capturing Asher Greyjoy and breaking the momentum of his enemies despite overwhelming odds. This is not a man whose arc feels complete, nor one who seems ready to simply perish in the blinding white of the north. In fact, George R.R. Martin has made a habit of framing the deaths of significant characters in ways that resonate through the narrative long after they're gone. If this is truly Stannis' end, it lacks the epic, sacrificial resonance that his character demands. And more importantly, it leaves Melisandre's visions in a frustrating limbo. Moreover, if Stannis were to survive, it would align beautifully with one of the most famous and often misunderstood prophecies in the series, that of Azor Ahai reborn. Melisandre is convinced that Stannis is the one who will pull a sword of fire, Lightbringer, from the flames to drive back the darkness. But, perhaps, instead they may have whispered of a long, grueling path, a warrior who must be broken, tempered, and remade in the cold, harsh fires of war. Perhaps Stannis is not Azor Ahai himself, but a critical step in the forging of that legendary figure, a king who must die to set the true hero on their destined path. If this theory holds, then Stannis' potential survival is not just a convenient twist, but a crucial piece in the broader struggle against the Great Other. Stannis, the Lord of Dragonstone, the shadow of a king, may yet find his true purpose on the frostbitten plains of the north, not as the final triumphant hero, but as the grim precursor, the last, desperate bulwark against the coming night. If his death is a ruse, then his arc is far from over. It merely awaits the moment when fire and ice truly clash. If we lean into this idea, Stannis' potential survival becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of his unlikely alliances. In the north, he has gathered a patchwork host of broken men, exiles, and fanatics, the kind of desperate, hard-edged force that echoes the very foundations of Westerosi legend. This ragtag army, bound more by necessity than loyalty, evokes the wild, scrappy spirit of the First Men, those who first battled the others thousands of years ago. Stannis, though often derided as cold and rigid, has shown a surprising ability to adapt when cornered. His decision to embrace the Lord of Light, for instance, was not born of blind faith, but of ruthless pragmatism. He chose fire because the cold of the north demands it, a choice that may yet prove prescient as the true winter descends. Furthermore, there is a fascinating narrative symmetry in the idea that Stannis' fate might still play a critical role in the war to come. Recall that Stannis is the only claimant to the Iron Throne who has actively sought to confront the White Walkers. recognizing the existential threat they pose. While the rest of the realm squabbles over crowns and castles, Stannis alone has marched north beyond the Wall and even saved the Night's Watch at the Battle of Castle Black. This move alone sets him apart as a king willing to defend Westeros, not just for power, but for survival. It's the act of a ruler who sees the larger game, one who may yet stand as a bulwark against the dark. If his death is merely a deception, then perhaps it serves a higher purpose, a final, desperate gambit to buy time or reposition his forces for a greater battle ahead. This theory also allows us to reinterpret the enigmatic nature of Melisandre herself. She is a character shrouded in fire and shadow, a priestess whose visions flicker and dance like the flames she peers into. If her conviction about Stannis is not entirely misplaced, it adds a fascinating layer to her character, painting her not as a misguided zealot, but as a flawed prophet struggling to interpret a chaotic, uncertain future. After all, the visions Melisandre receives are notoriously tricky, often twisted by her own hopes and fears. In the books, she glimpses snow in her fires and mistakenly assumes it to be a sign of Stannis' victory, not realizing that it might instead point to Jon Snow, or even to the snows of the north, where her chosen king fights his bitter war. And if we consider the broader narrative arcs that Martin has crafted, it's clear that themes of rebirth, resurrection, and transformation are at the core of this world. Jon Snow's own fate hangs in the balance at the end of A Dance with Dragons, his blood staining the snow of Castle Black in a scene rife with Christ-like sacrifice and mythical overtones. If Jon is to rise again, remade as the hero Westeros needs, it is fitting that the man who first brought fire and salvation to the Wall should also be reborn, his grim, unyielding purpose reforged in the fires of war and loss. If Stannis survives, it is not merely as a king seeking a throne, but as a warrior who has passed through the crucible of death itself, a fitting echo of Azor Ahai's legendary trial. Ultimately, if we take this view, then the idea of Stannis' survival adds a rich, tragic depth to his character. It paints him not as a failed pretender, but as a deeply flawed hero, one whose grim determination and uncompromising will might yet prove vital in the war against the Long Night. If Melisandre was early, if her flames merely flickered with glimpses of a fate still unfolding, then Stannis may yet find himself at the center of the storm, the shadow of a king rising once more to cast his light against the dark. Of course, for this theory to hold, Stannis must survive his current predicament, a feat that seems daunting but not impossible. As of the last we hear from him in A Dance with Dragons, Stannis is snowbound, his army trapped and starving as winter's icy grip tightens around them. However, George R.R. Martin has made it clear that Stannis is one of his most cunning commanders, a master of siegecraft and battlefield tactics. He has already proven his ability to turn dire situations to his advantage, from his defiant stand at Storm's End during Robert's rebellion to his unexpected rescue of the Night's Watch. Stannis thrives in situations where others might crumble, where sheer willpower and discipline can tip the scales of fate. In the cold, harsh north, these traits might be the difference between life and death. In fact, the very landscape around him might serve as a hidden ally. Stannis has positioned himself near the frozen lakes and treacherous forests surrounding Winterfell, a place where a smaller, disciplined force could ambush a larger, overconfident enemy. His decision to march his army overland through the bitter cold, bypassing the more direct but dangerous coastal approach, suggests a broader strategy at play, one that could involve luring his foes into a deadly trap, much like the crushing defeat he inflicted upon the wildlings at the Wall. If the Boltons are drawn out into the snowstorm, their heavy cavalry could find itself bogged down in the very terrain that Stannis has already proven he can master. It is a brutal, calculating tactic, but one that fits the iron-hearted, unyielding character we know. Moreover, the North itself may not be as hostile to Stannis as it appears. Despite the bitter cold and dwindling supplies, his army is not without allies. The mountain clans, tough and fiercely independent, have pledged their loyalty to him, swearing their swords not just to a king, but to a liberator, the man who saved them from the wildlings, and who they believe can free the North from the Bolton yoke. These clans, with their deep knowledge of the frozen highlands and their fearless, hit-and-run style of warfare, are perfectly suited to harassing and bleeding a larger force. If Stannis can coordinate their strikes, using the snow-covered forests and frozen rivers as natural choke points, he might yet turn the tide of battle. Additionally, we cannot ignore the shadow of betrayal that constantly hangs over the Boltons themselves. Ramsay Bolton, for all his sadistic cunning, is a hated figure, feared even by his own men. His brutal methods may have secured his father's throne, but they have also sown the seeds of dissent within his ranks. If word spreads that the Northern Lords still honor the memory of the Starks and resent the usurpers who now rule from Winterfell, then Stannis might find himself at the head of a swelling tide of rebellion, his ranks bolstered by those who long for the return of the old Northern blood. In this context, his survival would not just be a matter of outlasting a siege, but of lighting a spark that could set the entire North ablaze. And, of course, we have the great unknown of Jon Snow's fate to consider. If Jon is resurrected, a likely outcome given the heavy foreshadowing and Melisandre's presence at the wall, he may find himself more sympathetic to Stannis' cause. The two men, though vastly different in temperament, share a deep sense of duty and a mutual respect born of their shared struggle against the cold and the dark. If Jon rises again, changed yet still driven by the same fierce loyalty to his people, he might see in Stannis a potential ally, a king who at least understands the true threat facing the world. Together they could form a force capable of challenging not just the Boltons, but the far greater doom creeping down from the lands of always winter. All of this suggests that the pieces are in place for Stannis to survive, to endure, and perhaps even to rise again as a crucial figure in the War for the Dawn. His story, like the long, grinding winter itself, may yet unfold with a slow, relentless inevitability. Not a march, not to a glorious victory, but to a grim, hard-won redemption. But even if Stannis manages to survive the coming storm and break the Boltons, the question remains, what then? What role could he still play in the greater tapestry of Westeros, a land already fractured by years of civil war and plagued by the looming threat of the others? To answer this, we must look back at Stannis' central, defining trait, his unwavering commitment to justice and order. In a world sliding into chaos, this makes him both a deeply tragic and profoundly necessary figure. If the Long Night is truly returning, then the realm will need leaders who can stand firm in the face of unimaginable terror, who can command the loyalty of desperate, broken men, and who can impose order where only darkness reigns. It's also worth remembering that despite his harsh demeanor, Stannis is a king with a peculiar talent for attracting fiercely loyal followers, men and women who believe in his cause with a near-religious fervor. From the grimly loyal Davos Seaworth to the fiery Melisandre, Stannis has a way of inspiring those who see in him a chance to bring order to a lawless world. This sense of purpose, this iron-willed drive could make him a critical ally, or even a king of necessity in the wars to come, particularly if the threat of the others shatters the fragile alliances of the South and throws the Seven Kingdoms into deeper chaos. Moreover, there is a poetic justice in the idea of Stannis finding his true purpose not as a conqueror of the South, but as a final, desperate defender of the realm. In the end, his rigid sense of duty may prove to be his greatest strength, a source of unbreakable resolve, in a world where even the purest hearts are tested and broken. Imagine the grim, battered remnants of his army, their banners tattered, their faces gaunt with hunger and cold, standing as one final shield against the advancing tide of death. It would be a fitting end for the man who once declared that he would never yield, never bend, and never break. A last stand that echoes the tragic, heroic spirit of the first men themselves. This brings us back to the heart of Melisandre's prophecy. What if Stannis, the man she believed to be Azor Ahai reborn, is not the chosen one himself, but the necessary sacrifice, the bitter, unforgiving hammer that must break before the true blade can be forged. Perhaps Stannis' true destiny is not to save the world, but to prepare it for the coming fire and ice, to carve out a path through the darkness that others might follow. If so, his story is not one of failure, but of tragic, heroic endurance, the kind of bitter, hard-won glory that George R.R. Martin's world so often reserves for its most deeply flawed characters. And if we think about the broader themes of the series, the clash between duty and desire, the conflict between personal ambition and the greater good, Stannis' potential survival and ultimate sacrifice would resonate deeply. He is, after all, the king who has consistently chosen duty over desire, who has sacrificed family, honor, and even his own humanity in the pursuit of what he sees as his rightful destiny. In a world where the lines between hero and villain are often blurred, this makes Stannis a fascinating, uniquely tragic figure, one whose fate may yet surprise us all. And perhaps this is the ultimate irony, that the one king who has been willing to fight the true enemy, the one who marched north when others squabbled over thrones, might yet find himself remembered not as a usurper or a tyrant, but as a necessary, if deeply flawed, guardian of the realm. A bitter shadow who stood against the coming dark when others turned away. If Stannis' story is far from over, it's because his arc has always been about the relentless pursuit of purpose, even when the world seems determined to crush him. In a series where so many characters are driven by personal ambition, revenge, or the pursuit of love, Stannis stands apart as a man defined by an almost unbearable sense of duty. This uncompromising resolve makes him both admirable and tragic, a character who evokes both respect and pity. It is precisely this unyielding nature that suggests his role is not yet complete, that his story must move beyond mere defeat at Winterfell to something more profound. Something more fitting for a man who has always considered himself the rightful protector of Westeros. Of course, George R.R. Martin has often said that his story does not follow traditional fantasy tropes, and characters rarely receive the arcs one might expect. Yet Stannis' apparent end, as it currently stands, feels almost too abrupt, too devoid of the thematic closure that Martin usually weaves into his character resolutions. If Stannis were simply to die in the snow, it would be the end of a man too stubborn to know when to yield, a cold, harsh fate that mirrors his own nature. But if he survives, if he endures, when all seems lost, it becomes a statement about his character, about the power of grim determination and the painful path of honor. Moreover, there's something undeniably poetic about Stannis finding redemption not through conquest, but through sacrifice. If his death, when it eventually comes, were to buy precious time for Jon Snow, the Night's Watch, or even the North itself, it would echo the fate of those ancient heroes who fought against the Long Night. Just as Azor Ahai tempered his sword in the blood of his beloved, Stannis may find that his true purpose is not to rule, but to fight, to protect, to stand as a cold, unyielding bastion against the night. In this way, he becomes less of a failed king and more of a tragic hero, a man who ultimately finds meaning not in victory, but in resistance. And in a world as morally complex and unforgiving as Westeros, perhaps this is the only fitting end for Stannis Baratheon, a death that is not glorious, but purposeful, a legacy not of rule, but of survival. If Melisandre was not wrong, but early, then it means Stannis' death, if it has truly happened, is not the end of his legacy. It means that his actions, from saving the Night's Watch to challenging the Boltons, are ripples that will continue to affect the fate of Westeros long after his final battle. Even in death, his name might still carry weight, his story still echoing in the frozen halls of Winterfell as the world braces for the long night. In the end, perhaps Stannis' journey is not about claiming the Iron Throne or wielding Lightbringer, but about embodying the cold, harsh truth that survival sometimes requires hard choices and bitter resolve. If he survives his current predicament, it will not be as a triumphant king, but as a warrior too stubborn to die, fighting not just for his own sense of justice, but for a realm that may never truly understand his sacrifice. And in that, his story would not just be about one man's struggle for power, but about the enduring spirit of resistance, a reminder that in the darkest of nights, even the hardest, most unyielding men can become symbols of hope. So, what if Melisandre was just early? What if Stannis' death is a deception, a momentary setback rather than a final defeat? If that's the case, then the one true king of Westeros may still have a role to play in the battles to come, not as the savior himself, but as the grim, iron-hearted leader who paved the way for the dawn. In a world where the difference between heroes and villains often comes down to perspective, perhaps Stannis Baratheon's fate is not to rule, but to resist, and in doing so, to ensure that the world of men stands firm against the rising darkness.